before we start looking at some work, I'd just like to give a brief introduction to Sarah and how I came across her and her work and how I view it, which is perhaps different from the way you might view it, because I think it really sits very firmly within a trajectory of British photography. So I was trying to remember the first time I came across Sarah's work, and I couldn't quite remember, and I guess it must have been at her Royal College degree show, which is always a bit of a blur. It's a very crowded event, and a very popular event. It's seen as a way of finding out the next big thing or what's going on. It's very current and very an interesting college to go to. But I seriously began to consider it when I was putting together the How We Are exhibition for Tate, which I did alongside Val Williams. And it's funny because Sarah's work was always in that selection. I can't remember discussing it. I can't remember who suggested it first. It was just always there. And Tate never questioned it either. And Emma Dexter, who was then not head of photography, but very involved in photography at Tate, was a great supporter of Sarah's work. So when you're putting together a large show like that, the show had over 500 objects, and it was a history of British photography from Fox Talbot to Sarah Pickering. And you look at work in a very peculiar way. You look at it very ruthlessly. It's like, does this fit? Yes, no. And if it doesn't, it's out. Even if it's very, very strong work, it has to fit in with the conceptual ideas of the show. So the reason that it was always there is, for me, it's something quintessentially British about the work. It has a melancholy about it, a curiosity, and a kind of everyday ordinariness, which is infused with the bizarre as well. Politics are somehow implicit in the work, in the same way that, like, the very best of British music, it's always there as an undercurrent, if not in your face. It's unique and it's idiosyncratic. British documentary is driven by this kind of insatiable curiosity to record, to uncover, and to document. It has a strong social conscience, a melancholy that I've mentioned, and this desire to kind of discover things and reveal. And all of these traits are very apparent in Sarah's work. Mixed in with this is a very contemporary European aesthetic, which has become to be known as deadpan. I think Sarah's work is slightly different from this, but you can tell the influences. I think there's something much more sublime even working in there as well, which makes it, for me, something more interesting. And so it makes it somehow less alienating than a lot of that deadpan photography, which I have difficulty with. It's about order and control, it's about the fake and the real, and these are elements which are implicit to photography as well. So perhaps, Sarah, we could start with you telling us what we're looking at.
Okay, so Susan's actually selected the slides that we're going to look at, and I'm pleased to have her selection here. And we've chosen about 4 from each section that's featured in the book. And the first section, the opening section, is public order. And this work I actually began before I started my MA at the Royal College. And I went with actually this image in my portfolio to interview, and this image ended up being on the wall in the Tate, so there's a really nice kind of trajectory to it. And I had actually approached a lot of the emergency services, and I even wrote a letter to the anti-terrorist squad in Scotland Yard trying to make work with them, but they never got back in touch for some reason. I don't know why. I need to follow that up. But the police were very, very generous in terms of supporting what I wanted to do. And I think they, I suppose because they've got this awareness that they're funded by British taxpayers, and also they'd had a lot of bad press, they had this strategy to kind of create a sense of openness about what they do. So they were very welcoming. they were quite disappointed that I didn't actually photograph all the riots that they set up in these places. And these small towns, and they are kind of just about to scale, and they look very much like very run-down British towns. And they practice every day for riot situations in these towns. So they were disappointed that I didn't want to include the petrol bombs and the missiles and all the action that takes place there on a daily basis. But I did actually start off by photographing that and realise that there was so much more kind of power and like the sense of latent violence that's in the work is much more evocative than trying to get some action shots.
How did you even know about them?
Well, I didn't. I kind of turned up and thought, wow, I can't believe this. It kind of felt like a gift. It's an amazing thing. So I just wanted to photograph some kind of training exercise. And I'd been thinking about the kind of history of constructed photography, or, you know, it was fairly contemporary to the time that I was making it. This was in 2002. And I was thinking about the idea of the ready-made and the sort of things that institutions do in terms of representing what might happen. So I suppose at the back of my mind, I was thinking about how people prepare for the worst case scenario as well. So,
and it seems quite a strange and abstract idea to pursue with the conviction that you've pursued. What is there something autobiographical or something that sparked off this interest?
Yeah, I think I didn't really acknowledge at first. I've kind of wanted to be a forensic photographer, or, you know, really like the idea of being some kind of an investigator. So I was kind of living out that fantasy by working with these institutions. And I was also, I think in retrospect, I've realised that my dad, who's a very traditional working class guy, is very into rules. Is like my house, my rules. And I was very into smashing the system. I go, well, I'm not going to do that, Dad. So I was kind of thinking about rebellion and this idea that these patriarchal systems are set in place and they're kind of a given. So nobody's questioning why these towns are kind of designed in the way they're designed. And I suppose public order situations have really changed in the last 10 or 15 years, and riots happen anyway. They happen in the countryside about fox hunting or in the city. So these places don't really represent the rioters anymore. So there's a kind of, I suppose it's a sense of reinforcement of a social stereotype.
And that runs throughout all the bodies of work, isn't it? That it's a predominantly male, it's predominantly working class, the situations that you've gone into.
Yeah.
And it's like saying, well, I don't know, people who beat their wives are from a certain social class, and that just doesn't rub, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So why do you think that these ideas are perpetuating in the training?
It's really hard to say. And I think they haven't been questioning it enough. But after the last, the most recent riots in the city, or they're actually peaceful demonstrations, they've had to really reconsider how they go about their training, because they get covered in protective clothing, and they've got shields, and they've got batons, they've got pepper spray, and they're totally kind of prepared for a very violent confrontation. So I suppose the system is kind of self-perpetuated, but actually the nature of what they encounter has changed dramatically. So when protesters saying we're doing a peaceful protest, and they're being attacked, then there's something which is inherently wrong about that. So they've had to rethink what they're doing. You just to go back to your question about, you know, the autobiographical in the work, another thing that really I think has influenced the work is the fact that my mum is always worried about the worst case scenario. So she'll tell me how to escape a swarm of bees. I'm going to Yosemite later on, and she's actually quite worried, very worried about me being attacked by bears. And she said, well, the brown bears, or is it the black bears? You have to lie on the floor and pretend you like roadkill, and the other one you have to go, right, I've seen you. And she was really worried because she couldn't remember which was which, so I might do the wrong thing.
So that, I mean, that definitely was an impetus for your interest in this, do you think?
Yes, I think I've always been very hyper aware of what might happen, what kind of worst case scenarios happen, and then to see actually institutions are always trying to plan for the unexpected and try and control and manage something that can't be controlled and managed too well. So I think that kind of definitely feeds into the motivation for making the work.
This was also in the show, and one which I really like because it's less obvious than the others that it's sets or it's fake, and that is a scene that you see as soon as you get outside of London. You see in every small town in Britain, with the kind of the generic name for the nightclub, and it's one of those images which, if you saw out of context, you would know was strange and wrong, and you couldn't quite figure out why, because obviously the traffic lights aren't working and there's nobody in the street. But beyond that, it's very hard. That balance between fake and real and fantasy and real is very fine, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I think again, the sort of social stereotyping that happens is like slightly off kilter here, because there's an antique shop just next door with a this is Dickens. I guess it's an antique shop. Maybe it sells pine furniture, but it's kind of got that kind of sign writing that suggests it's that kind of shop. And I found out because some of the shops have got these different names. And I said, these names after particular people, and they told me that some of the names come from either the officers' wives or their dogs. So
that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And then the next one is kind of the complete opposite, where you get the backs of the sets.
Yeah, that's actually behind the building that we just saw on the previous slide. Yeah.
So when you went in to photograph this, did you have any idea how the series was going to look, how big it was going to be, or was it really just more intuitively done?
It was fairly intuitive. I actually found it very hard to stop photographing because I was allowed such a lot of access. And, well, it was kind of a lot of access because I could keep returning, but I was only allowed to photograph at the times when they were not doing their rioting, so they were having their tea break or their lunch break. I remember there was one time that I went there and they had this special scenario where somebody was taken hostage on one of the underground trains, and they had to work out how to free the hostage, and it kind of went on. It got a little bit complex, and then it was lunchtime, so they went off for lunch. So I went and did my photos then. But again, that kind of talks about that sense of realism. They're in this town. It's been built especially for creating an authentic situation. But also they have their lunch break.
But there's something so British about that.
Yes.
And institutions of, having worked in museums where literally it stops at 4 o'clock and everyone drinks tea and has biscuits still. And it sends me bonkers, but that sense of order is perfect for a lot of people. And the army being a kind of great example of that structure being a great support network for people.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I was photographing, I was finding it quite difficult to stop photographing because every time I went, things had changed or another prop had arrived on the scene and things looked a little bit more dishevelled. But I kind of finally put an edit together and realised I've just got so much material. And the towns are smallish, so I wanted to make sure that I got a sense of the kind of claustrophobia of the town. So you never see the outside perimeter fence, you never see the edges of the town. And the only image which shows the behind the scenes is the behind the flick slide that you just showed.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to show so much about the background or the artifice. It was more creating a sense of place.
In my introduction, I mentioned this element within Sarah's work that, for me, takes it away from being kind of strictly deadpan, which is a a phrase that I have difficulty with anyway. But here's a good example for me is the sky, and it has that kind of almost romantic gathering of clouds, which you wouldn't see in a lot of deadpan work that was coming out around about the same time. When I say that, it's people like Struff and Ruff and Candida Hoffer as well. But Sarah's has a kind of is quite different because it does have this natural element throughout that adds a softness or a sublimeness. Were you influenced by that work, or you must be, of course, aware of
definitely influenced by this kind of objective, sort of topographical way of encountering something. So yeah, I was influenced by that, but again, because of the limited time slots that I was at the environments, it was often a bit of a kind of moment of serendipity where I got some great lighting or a certain prop was in a certain place. And of course, things which didn't work so well were edited out, you know, hundreds of images edited out the series. I think the motivation for this work came about because you know, it was photographed at the time that we went to war with Iraq, and we, well, I was involved in demonstrations, as I'm sure a lot of people were, and that kind of sense of powerlessness that even though hundreds of thousands of people demonstrate against going off to war, and you know, so your country's involved in something that you actually don't feel convinced by, and I mean, it was one of those kind of situations where this was happening, and it was a very kind of extreme and violent event, and very hard to imagine, at the same time as being aware of the great risks and the terrible things that the soldiers have to expose themselves to. There's also an unknowability about that actual the way that they would encounter this. And so as the series developed, I was thinking about the training scenarios that the soldiers go through, and the soldiers who are new go through training scenarios in home territories, and they would use devices like this to create a sense of realism. And there's something which is very spectacular and also very tragic about them. And you know, there's kind of references to the filmic, there's references to computer games, and also to the tradition of landscape photography. So there's some very complicated kind of influences which exist in the work, and it's not very easy to sort of unpack it all.
The just to kind of put a time slot on this, the public order was done for your MA show, yeah?
And actually I had nearly, I think maybe 7 or 8 pieces completed from the Explosion series, and I showed one of them in the MA show as well. Okay. So, as it's kind of about order, you seem to be able to charm your way into places quite easily. Yeah, well, I think it helps to be a woman. I don't think they'd be so interested in getting some guy. It's a real novelty because, you know, as I mentioned, they're very patriarchal environments, and I think at the police training centre there may be, out of, I don't know, maybe 40 training officers, there were 2 women, and all of the pyrotechnic people were guys. So, I don't know, maybe it makes a difference. But yes, I think maybe I'm quite persuasive.
And what was your intent? What did you say to them that you wanted? Why? Yeah.
I think because they love what they're doing, they think it's enough that I want to photograph it. And you know, whether they read anything more into it or not, they think that's a great photograph of that effect. So the guy who set this effect up had actually worked for Bond movies, but it was really important to me that these were devices that were used in military or police training. But he was very interested in the device looking very visually accurate as much as that can be. And yet, as you look through the series of them, there's something very inadequate and approximate about them, and kind of slightly pathetic.
Yeah, totally, because of the scale.
Yeah, yeah. And even when I print these for exhibition, they're about, I think this is about 1¼ meters. I'm not sure what that is in inches, but you know, nowhere near as big as that. So, there is something very seductive and dynamic about it. Yeah, this is an image that's titled Landmine, and the titles come from the actual product. So these are the products that people are buying, and so the manufacturer is anticipating that the military will buy this landmine device, and there's something very horrific to contemplate.
Absolutely. There's something really sinister there, which is belied by the beauty of the image. So when you went to photograph, were you there with people who were there looking to buy?
Yes, yeah. So I think there's something which I mentioned the constructed image earlier on as well, and there was something about the idea of constructing a scenario where I would be able to anticipate something. So I go along to a scene and I find this kind of ready-made event or set. And then, so I suppose my premise for going there is having a preconceived idea of what work I expect to make, but I'm always surprised by it. But it's very important to me that this is a document of something that actually took place, and it's a very bizarre and surreal event, but it's actually a shopping trip for the police or the military, and they're standing to one side of the camera making their shopping list. So this seemingly bizarre scenario is a scenario that's set up and taking place. And lots of these scenarios take place without us seeing them. So I love the power of the photograph to be able to kind of extract something and represent it and make it accessible as well.
The next one here definitely has an element of that patheticness about it, which again I think is something which is really core to British photography, is a kind of smallness. It's a really tiny island, and it doesn't do epic like American photography does. It doesn't do romantic like Italian photography does. There's something really kind of ordinary and this sense of pathos that's really there. Which I kind of like, I used to hate, and now I just love. It's something very Alan Bennett about it all. So what's going on here?
So this is title Shot, and there was a little string of devices, and it was to replicate a machine gun firing. So they went off in very quick succession, and what you see is, I think, one or maybe the trail of a second one going off. So it was more of a kind of audio thing, but there was a little bit of visual with it.
It's also I think the social backdrop that you mentioned about those marches against the war in the in 2002. Was it?
It was around then, yeah.
Yeah,
my sense of timing's not great. But.
And they were, for those who don't know about them, they were really extraordinary events which kind of motivated the whole of London, and they weren't. There were people, just everyone marched. It was an extraordinarily moving day and a series of days.
It felt massively empowering.
Yeah.
And it wasn't at all. And, that kind of cheatedness, I suppose, kind of comes across with the work where, institutions are trying to empower themselves with these devices or these scenarios, and actually it's impossible to do. How do you approximate something? How do you control and plan for these scenarios? And there's something that feels quite futile about that.
Yeah, absolutely. In the show, we hung Sarah's work opposite these vast portraits of young training Marines, who are, they're boys, they're 19 years old. You could see their spots and their sweat. And there was something I really liked about having these very human faces, which were, twice the size, if you can imagine this here, they were kind of almost twice the size of the length of this room, these huge haunting faces opposite public order. I think it had a nice, dynamic to it, yeah. Sorry, that was a tangent. So this is an ongoing series.
Yes, if I get the opportunity, it's always nice to go and see something exciting.
So,
I think, you know, I am a bit of a pyromaniac, but, you know, I like the idea of going somewhere where it's safe, because, of course, my mum would hate it if I kind of started messing around with explosives and fires. So somebody else does that, and I know it's controllable, and I know that I'm standing at the health and safety distance away from it, and but it's exciting.
And I mean, when you're taking them, do you kind of think through, you know, those things that we've talked about of, you know, this is actually going to be used somewhere to kill somebody? Do those thoughts kind of go through your mind, or this is a pretense of something that's going to go and kill? You know, you tie your head up in knots, don't you?
Yeah. Well, I was really horrified by the idea that somebody was making a product called napalm as a pyrotechnic device, and you think, how on earth could that be used in a training scenario, and why? What would the need be? But someone's manufactured it, and it's a viable product on the market, and yes, it is horrendous. And, you know, the same goes for the fire scene work as well, where, which we'll talk about next. But yeah, it's very troubling. But I think there are kind of lots of layers to it, because of course we love watching you know, movies which have got the most explosions or you know, dramatic things happening, and always a handful of people get killed here and there, even you know, in all kinds of films, even Jurassic Park, people get killed. You know, films for kids.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And I find that kind of sense of the sense of excitement that people get from watching a movie, and how much drama exists in it that kind of is removed yet related to the world that we live in.
You mentioned the fire series, and this is one that I selected. And again, I think it's probably easiest if you just explain what the project is and what everyone's looking at.
Yeah, this series I photographed at the Fire Service College, and one of the people at the Public Order Centre.
Backtrack.
Yeah.
What made you think, oh, I know, I'll go to the fire station?
I was just about to say.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'll just be quiet.
So one of the people at the Public Order Training Centre, one of the chief inspectors, said, oh, I did a training course here, you'd love it. And a lot of my work comes about because people who I'm working with get really into my mindset and say, oh, you should try this and that. I mean, very often they don't. But I look up their suggestions and I might follow up on it. And so, yeah, I got access to go to the Fire Training College, and a lot of the place looked like the Public Order Training Centre. So there were domestic buildings, industrial buildings, there was urban search and rescue, there were plane crashes, and I photographed all of those, but it didn't really feel like I was pushing myself or moving my work forwards in any way. And then I found these things called burn units, which were shipping containers, and they were plasterboarded out and set dressed and made to look like studio apartments or bedsits or living rooms, or kind of very basic and very working class environments. And so it was really I suppose I made this decision to push myself a bit further, and I photographed these spaces before the fires were in there, because I had access to do that. I had access to photograph them after everything was burnt up. And there was just something very static about it. And thinking back to the way the kind of power of the explosion work is this kind of suspended moment, and also this sense of the cyclical nature of the training exercise, that it will happen again and again. And so seeing these places on fire and trying to photograph them on fire, which took a little bit of persuasion, really worked for me, I think.
And also that sense of making something so dynamic and so uncontrollable still, and controlling it is something which visually is very seductive to a viewer, and must be, as a photographer as well, must be really, you know, that's kind of what everyone wants to do. You know.
Yeah. Well, it was an amazing thing to be kind of stood there. And I think you really get that impression from the photograph that something should be done. There's a fire, we should put it out. But all of the fire officers standing around admiring the fire, and I'm there photographing it in this doorway. And the fire has to totally burn out because these are training exercises for forensic investigators. So they'll go through the ashes and they'll look for burn patterns, which are the ways or the markings that the fire has kind of left traces of, and it can reveal whether an accelerant like lighter fluid has been used or how the fire started. So the training officers never actually, or the people doing the exercise never see the place as it is here. They only see the ashes.
Right. So this is just a process.
Yes, yeah.
And again, as you mentioned, the scenarios, which also title the work, are kind of deviant, aren't they? They're it's again like saying, well, fires never happen it doesn't happen in Wall Street, or doesn't happen.
The Queen had a fire though.
Yeah,
they didn't test out on her house kind of style shipping container. But I mean, yeah, it's partly practical because if you've got to set fire to all this stuff, it has to be fairly cheap. But you could kind of make a kind of IKEA or a kind of modernist minimal apartment quite nicely on not much money. But it's always these kind of very socially coded places which get built again and again, and they're kind of filled with knickknacks, and you get a sense of who the occupant is. And yeah, as you say about the titles, I kind of just extracted something from the scenario. So for the instance, this is cigarette, and I was thinking about sort of tabloid headlines, and the scenarios are always, so the previous one we looked at was glue sniffing kids. And the scenarios are always filled with deviant and disturbing people, so perverts, prostitutes, and kids who are neglected, which is very tragic, but maybe has some kind of normalising effect for the officers going through this, that there's something so different from themselves that
Do you
makes
think?
it... I don't know. A social scientist said that to me as a theory. I don't know what you think about it.
I don't know. I just don't know why it kind of perpetuates, and who thinks of it. Is it what department thinks up these scenarios?
Yeah,
it's puzzling.
Yeah. Well, I had a theory that it was based on British soap operas, and there's always like somebody in EastEnders got murdered on Christmas Day this year, and it's like you sit down, you have your turkey, and then you all gather as a family and watch a murder. In a very similar looking environment. So, that kind of
there is a
salacious story.
Thirst for it, yeah.
So I think, there's probably a bit of that. The soap opera fed back into it. I don't know.
It's really curious. Yeah, it's really curious. And as prints, how do these... Are these bigger than the explosions? Do they have a kind of visual...
They're slightly smaller, and I wanted them to kind of feel like there was a relationship to the doorway that I photographed through. So I'm really rubbish on remembering sizes, and especially with inches, but it's probably about a quarter of that size, I think. So, it's not massive, but there's this kind of sense of direct... experience, this relationship of looking through a doorway that I tried to get across with the work.
And again, like public order, there's that brilliant tension between what's real and what's fake, because actually the fire looks fake in a lot of them, and the rooms look real, and then you've got this kind of blast. You think, perhaps that's photoshopped on, or but that's actually the only real thing in the picture. So again, there's this idea going throughout all your work of this, the real and the fake, and the fantasy and the real.
Yeah, and I think it's in terms of making the work as well. A few people have said, it looks like it's digitally altered, and I really like the way that these strange things happen and are happening in the world around us, and it's just a case of kind of rooting them out. And yeah, there's an extra layer of, well, is that really, isn't it? Because of this idea that it could have been digitally altered. So I think that actually adds to
Yeah,
the
no, I agree.
potency. This is chip pan. People don't have chip pans over here, do they?
No, I don't think many people have them in Britain either. They stopped about 1974, I think. Yeah. It's for deep frying French fries, as a transatlantic translation there.
Yeah, there was a lot of smoke with this one because they're trying to get a lot of oil lit, and they couldn't get the oil hot enough. So with this one, they had to set fire to a lot of newspaper. You can see all the bits of newspaper all over the place to try and stoke up the fire. And then the officers who come in have to identify this as a chip pan fire, but actually it's a newspaper fire with oil. Yeah. So the way that they even set fire, they had, for the cigarette, which was one of the previous slides, they had a cigarette which was lit inside a toilet roll, and then they kept having to go back and relight it. It kept going out. They were really struggling to get it going.
And
they got a little blowtorch on it. Yes.
And they went off for lunch.
Thinking about their lunchtime as well. So, yeah, a lot of the ways that the fires are set up are kind of constructed and approximated in themselves.
Right. This is for me, possibly one of the most shocking images in the whole of the body of the work, because it's more explicit.
Yeah, well, again, that was really horrible to see, and the space is horrible, and there's something very kind of visceral about being in these very carbonated spaces. It feels wrong, and then when you just... I was basically given free rein to drive around this space. I liked it because I had a flashing light on top of the car and got a yellow jacket, got to dress up a little bit. So I was wandering around by myself, and I knew which buildings the scenarios were happening in, although in some of these buildings I started getting really nervous because they're quite big, and they were setting up, so you can see in the next image, they were setting up these straw pallets or these pallets with straw in these containers. So the fire never spreads beyond them. But I knew that the training was imminent, and I had a real paranoia about being stuck in the place. And I absolutely stunk after being in there because it was just really sooty and quite awful. So yeah, all of the spaces felt quite shocking, but yeah, when you see this family unit piled up, it is very disturbing. But at the same time, there's something aesthetically compelling about it.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially if you kind of counterpoint those with the flame scenes. You know, they're a lovely balance for each other, aren't they? You know, they are very seductive, but also repellent at the same time.
Yeah, with these, when I printed them. I made them, I know this in inches actually. This was about 50 by 60 inches, I think, in the end. And I printed them onto fibre-based matte paper. And this matte paper is absolutely amazing. And it really echoes the very sooty surface of the objects that I'd photographed. And I really... I'm very interested now, and also in the work that I'm making now, about the photograph as an object and kind of compressing that space, the photographic space and the subject and the object of the photograph. So I think that device worked well to do that.
Because they're very physical pieces. You have a very physical reaction to them. So that absolutely needs to be reflected in the medium, doesn't it? And in the paper, and how big they are, and
yeah,
all those things are really crucial to the work.
Yeah, and I printed them with white borders, and this kind of sense of the history of the black and white analog print was really something that I was thinking about as well, and the way that there's a kind of sense of tradition and how photographs, like the Secessionists, for instance, were really interested in making work which felt like it had some kind of artistic surface. It might look a bit more like drawing. So I was thinking about that as well. So I wanted to reference that.
But also photographs of evidence as well, you know, those kind of cheap bromide, black and white prints that, you know, are full of in police archive drawers. Not anymore, but they were. You know, that has that reference back to those as well, doesn't it? It's and kind of taking that kind of into an art realm of like Larry Sultan and Mike Mandel's Evidence.
I love that book, yes. So again, you know, that's something that has kind of fed into it. So I think that the references are very multifaceted.
You mentioned that you're working on new work. Do you want to talk about it yet or not?
Yes, I can talk about it. I mean, there's some stuff that has to be made quite imminently. I'm doing a project with the Jerwood Space in London, and it's a 3-person show, and the theme is locate, and I am making work yet again with the police, and it's on the fakes and forgeries that were made by the most prolific forger in the history of known forgeries. There's probably someone else who's better who nobody knows about. Anyway, they know this guy. So I'm making a series of photographs about that, or some work about it. And I'm also doing another project with a commissioning organisation called Locus Plus, which is based in Newcastle. And they've been very generous and said I can make work about whatever I want. So I'm sort of bringing together much more kind of sculptural elements and sort of chance elements of kind of quite diverse subject matter. So, for instance, I've photographed some kind of security devices which kind of obliterate the environment that the person who's broken into, so they can't see what they were trying to steal. And then I've also been working with the forensic department. I got to wear like a zip-up suit for that. That was good. And I've been photographing blood pattern analysis. So the marks, I'm working in black and white on those in particular, and the marks are much more akin to sort of abstract expressionism than they are kind of scene of crime. So, you know, this kind of play between where the photograph sits and what it references is something that is probably an area that I'm investigating in a lot of detail at the moment.
I'm thinking of other big institutions like the army, and the church springs to mind, being a monolithic institution. Vatican is kind of in my head. That you know, the world has moved on, and it hasn't in some way. That the army is suffering so much because the world has moved on and the structures haven't. Is that something that interests you, or is it much more about this idea of public order or state control?
It's hard to say. I think I'm becoming more interested in the qualities of the subject matter, if that makes sense, but a kind of complex quality. And so if I find that in a church, or I find it you know, at a health and safety laboratory, then they're the kind of place that I'd like to go. But I think, you know, my investigation is quite loose and fairly open. And I photograph a lot of things and then just reject it because it just doesn't work right. So, yeah, there's a sense of it being intuitive, and then when I kind of make the edit and start reflecting on it, I become much more aware of what the motivations were.
Okay.
That was a bit of an oblique answer, wasn't it?
Well, I think often you don't... Well, I think it says a lot about your working practices that you actually do work quite intuitively, and you just kind of follow where your nose goes. And then it's conceptually threaded together afterwards.
Yeah.
Which, you know, photographers and artists work in all kinds of different ways. There's ones that won't pick up a camera until they've thought absolutely everything through. And again, I think that fits in with the way that the work looks, is that mixture of intuitive and very carefully considered, which is reflected in the look of the pieces as well.
Yeah.
I was going to quickly repeat the question. It's from a filmmaker who said there was something inherently cinematic for him about the work. And would Sarah be interested in going into real life scenarios of battle or combat and photographing there?
Well, I'd be too worried for a starter to go into war zones. But I think the work came about because of the heavily mediated way that we experience war, through the war, through the photographs that war photographers make, because the military, when they have embedded photographers, as I'm sure you know, go through and edit and check over what can then be allowed to be sent off to the picture desk, who again will edit and then kind of mediate what we experience, what we see. And while there are plenty of blogs and online ways that you can access a much more broader scope of that type of photography, my work is about the citizen at home who can't even begin to imagine that, and also about the way that these scenarios are played out and practiced, and so it's about the anticipation of those events as well. Yeah, I meet some very interesting people, and I enjoy meeting people, and I enjoy kind of trying out jobs, and I never have to see a dead body or kind of take a swab or anything like that. Everything is very anodyne and cleaned up in some ways. So I had this idea I might be a forensic photographer, and I'm so squeamish, I'm pathetic, I just couldn't deal with it. So I think that motivation came from a real excitement about the possibility of the medium to report on an event, and I think that kind of comes across in the work as well. So it's not like I'm trying to fulfill a job ambition. It's more that there's some complicated things going on with all kinds of influences which we've talked about in terms of how I broach the subjects that I'm working with.
But this kind of distancing, this fiction of a fiction that's going on, I think, again, it's really interesting to put in a social context of, we're a nation at war, and yet that seems so remote and so unreal, that this work really taps into those kind of real public anxieties about it.
Yeah, and then when you think about the kinds of language that the military use, so it's shock and awe, and I think you could use the term shock and awe to describe the explosion images. There's something quite amazing about those. There's something amazing about Hollywood movies, and so that's a term, the kind of soundbite that is troubling in itself in terms of how the military want war to be perceived by the people that they're invading, or the people that they're kind of battling with, or those at home.
The question is really about black and white and colour, and how the colour seemed to have an element of the surreal infused in with it, and the black and white seemed more shocking.
It's partly how the slides are presented, and it's partly about the shift of emphasis in the work. So the prints are incredibly seductive. You can't help, when you look at the prints, to just think, wow. I mean, it's because of the surface and the quality and the fibre paper, and that in itself is something that kind of gets lost. I think they've printed them really well in the book, and they've tried to leave them without a glaze on, but it doesn't even come across quite the same in the print itself. And so I kind of I suppose the same motivations behind the work are there, but it's like the emphasis has kind of shifted. So yeah, the explosions are shocking and disturbing, but they're kind of beautiful at the same time. And so I think the incident pictures, but it's just the shift in terms of the weight, on terms of disturbing versus beauty is altered.
I think also what's there is that tradition of black and white photography as well, being a kind of documentary. It seems more truthful somehow. And also it was interesting that when you talked about the black and white work, is you talked about your own anxiety in the situations, whereas the other situations you found very thrilling.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
And so that maybe that's projected onto the images as well.
Yeah, I felt really disturbed by those spaces. They were horrible to be in, and somewhere around the time that I was making that work, I think some of the fire officers who'd been training in that space had been killed in a warehouse fire, and they would have been kind of going up and down. So that kind of felt closer to me. And then a really good friend of mine had a flat fire, and everything was destroyed in his flat. Fortunately, he was unhurt. I suppose there were lots of things going on at the time of just producing the work that kind of shifted my my sense of investment in it and kind of emotional exposure.
It was a statement rather than a question, which is okay. Don't worry, you don't have to have a question mark. And it's about this the contradiction between the beautiful aesthetics of some of the work and subject matter.
I think, yeah, this is an issue that comes up again and again when people make work which is kind of political, or war photographers often, like Luke Delahaye has been criticised for making work that seems much more concerned with aesthetics than the kind of tragedy of war. But I think it's very problematic to say, well, you can't couple aesthetics with political subject matter, because who would want to look at something that wasn't aesthetic?
I think it's subtle work, and I think that's kind of part of the power and the interest for me. It doesn't have, like the Luke Delahaye, which is kind of sucks you and then it slams you over the face. It's a really obvious tactic. And I think Sarah's work is it's subtler than that, and that does add a layer of complexity and difficulty to it, which I think, for me, is why she's here and she's got the book and she was in the show. It's something that's always been there. Whenever this comes up a lot about aesthetics and subject matter and I always think of Roger Fenton moving those cannonballs around to make a better shot of the Crimean War. For portfolios to sell, to make money. It's part of this isn't war photography, but it's such a strong tradition in war photography, of which this is a kind of, if you had a Venn diagram, it would be a section of it. Any more? Okay, well, thanks very much. Thank you to Sarah for
Thanks, Susan,
sharing her time and for coming along tonight.